If anybody had told me that one day I would betray the man who gave me everything, I would have laughed and sworn it was impossible. But life is not that simple. It started on a quiet Wednesday afternoon when Jack walked into my classroom and said, "Ms. Thompson, the principal asked me to help you arrange the lesson." I should have said no. I should have sent him back to his father's office. But instead, I smiled and let him in. Little did I know that opening that door was the beginning of a story I may never stop regretting. Jack was my stepson, yes, but he was also a man in his own right. Tall, with the kind of confidence that made people turn when he entered the room. He was polite, always respectful, but there was something in the way he looked at me, as if he could see beyond the surface. I didn't notice it at first, or maybe I did, but I pushed it aside. After all, I was the respected Mrs. Thompson, wife to the principal of one of New York's most prestigious schools. As the days turned into weeks, those little glances grew longer. The silence between us started to carry an unspoken weight. One day during a break, Jack stayed behind to help rearrange the bookshelves. It was just the two of us in the room. The air felt heavy, like something was about to happen. Then he said it, so softly I almost didn't hear. "Do you ever feel like you're pretending to be happy?" I froze. "What kind of question is that, Jack? You shouldn't ask me that kind of thing," I replied, my voice firmer than I felt. But he didn't back down. Instead, he looked at me with those piercing eyes and said, "Sometimes pretending can be exhausting." I didn't know what to say. For a moment, I saw myself through his eyes, not the perfect teacher, not the loyal wife, but a woman who had spent years hiding her true feelings. And that was how it started. Not with a grand confession or a moment of weakness, but with a simple question that opened a door I had kept locked for years. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jack's words echoed in my mind like a stubborn song on repeat. "Do you ever feel like you're pretending to be happy?" I turned to look at my husband, Mark, snoring softly beside me. He was a good man, no doubt. Respected, hardworking, and generous to a fault. But our marriage had become routine, predictable, like morning assembly. There was no spark anymore, just duty. I wasn't sure when it had faded, but I had grown used to the emptiness. The next day at school, Jack came into the classroom early, carrying a pile of textbooks. He set them on my desk and stood there, as if waiting for something. "Good morning, Jack," I said, trying to sound casual. "Good morning, Ms. Thompson." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, something I was afraid to name. As the weeks went by, it became harder to ignore the way he lingered in the room after class, asking questions that had little to do with the lesson, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, and worst of all, the way my heart fluttered when I saw him. One Friday afternoon it happened. The school was quiet. The students had all gone home, and the staff room was nearly empty. I stayed back to finish grading papers, and Jack appeared at the door again. "Ms. Thompson, do you need help with anything?" I should have said no. I should have sent him home. But instead, I nodded. "Come in," I said. He walked in, closing the door behind him. There was a tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. He sat across from me, flipping through some papers, but I could feel his eyes on me every few seconds. "Why do you always stay back so late?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Work doesn't finish itself," I replied lightly, trying to avoid his gaze. "You work too hard," he said, his voice low and serious. "You deserve more than this." I looked up then, startled by his tone. "More than what?" "More than being just Mrs. Thompson." My breath caught. There it was again, that unspoken thing hanging between us, daring me to acknowledge it. I shook my head and forced a smile. You don't know what you're talking about, Jack. But he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his eyes locked on mine. I know what I see, he said softly. For a moment, I forgot who I was. I forgot I was his stepmother, his teacher, the wife of his father. All I saw was a young man who saw through me in a way nobody else had. The sound of the janitor's broom scraping the hallway snapped me back to reality. I stood up abruptly, gathering my papers. It's late. You should go home, I said, my voice trembling. He stood too, his eyes never leaving mine. Good night, Ms. Thompson, he said, his voice carrying a weight that stayed with me long after he had gone. That weekend, I avoided him completely. I didn't look for him at church on Sunday, and I made sure not to be alone in the same room with him at home, but it was useless. His presence lingered in my mind no matter how hard I tried to push it away. By Monday, I had convinced myself that it was all in my head. I told myself to be professional, to act like nothing had happened. But when Jack walked into my classroom that morning, his smile made my resolve crumble. Good morning, Ms. Thompson, he said, his voice warm and familiar. Good morning, Jack, I replied, my heart beating too fast. I knew then that this wasn't something I could ignore. Whatever was happening between us, it wasn't going away, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted it to. By midterm, it had become a routine. Jack would linger after class, offering to help with little tasks that didn't need doing. We didn't cross any lines, at least not yet. But the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it was as if he was waiting for me to give in, and I was close. So close. One evening, I stayed late in my classroom. The sun had set, leaving the room bathed in the soft glow of the overhead light. I was lost in thought, staring at the stack of lesson plans on my desk, when Jack walked in. Ms. Thompson, why are you still here? He asked, his voice breaking the silence. I could ask you the same thing, I replied, trying to sound casual, but my hands trembled as I shuffled my papers. He leaned against the door frame, his posture relaxed, but his eyes serious. I wanted to see you, he said simply. Those 4 words hit me like a wave. My heart raced, my thoughts scattered. I stood up abruptly, needing to put some distance between us. Jack, you can't say things like that, I said, my voice shaking. Why? Not? He challenged, stepping closer. It's the truth. I turned away, my back to him. This is wrong. You know it is. Wrong for who? He asked, his voice soft. You or me? I didn't have an answer. I felt trapped, torn between what I knew was right and the pull of something I couldn't explain. Jack, please, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Go home. He stood there for a moment, and I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my back. Then, without another word, he turned and left. That night, I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The guilt was unbearable, but so was the longing. How had I let it get this far? The next morning, I avoided Jack completely. I threw myself into my work, keeping my door shut and my conversations short. But he was persistent. He left little notes on my desk, asking if I was okay. He smiled at me in the hallways, as if nothing had happened. I knew I had to put an end to it, but I didn't know how until one day I overheard 2 teachers talking in the staff room. That Jack is such a fine young man, one of them said. If I were 10 years younger, I'd have tried my luck. The other laughed. Don't even try it. His stepmother is right here in this school. Can you imagine the scandal? I froze. The scandal, the shame, the destruction it would bring, not just to my marriage, but to my career, my reputation, and Jack's future. I went home that evening and sat in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. Who had I become? How had I allowed myself to even consider something that could ruin so many lives? That night, I made a decision. The next morning, I called Jack into my classroom before the students arrived. He walked in, looking concerned. "Ms. Thompson, is everything okay?" he asked. "No, Jack," I said firmly, looking him straight in the eye. Whatever this is, it has to stop, now." He looked stunned, as if he hadn't expected me to say it. "But Ms. Thompson," I interrupted. "You're young, Jack. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't let one mistake ruin everything. And I should have known better. I should never have let this get this far." He was silent for a long time, and then he nodded slowly. "I understand, Ms. Thompson," he said quietly. As he walked out of the room, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. Advice for women. Sometimes life will test you with temptations that feel too strong to resist. But in moments of weakness, remember the bigger picture, the lives you've built, the trust others have in you, and the future you want for yourself. One mistake, no matter how tempting, can shatter everything you've worked so hard for. Protect your peace, guard your heart, and always choose what is right over what feels good in the moment.